I was brought back to some really disturbing memories that I had a long time ago. I don't mean this in a way of repressed memory. It was never repressed. It was just a very disturbing thing that happened to myself and some friends on a camping trip. We told people back then, quite a few people, but it's a pretty strange and pretty old story now that I make myself remember it all. Of course, nobody believed us. It was your typical only the people that were there really know what happened. And I have long since fallen out of touch with the people involved. So over the last 20 some years it had sort of fallen in the back of my brain as a lot of those things do. I spent some time trying to recall everything I can. I'm going on 40 now, and this was back in my college day. So here's my story, and I'm gonna give as many details as I can remember. It was summer of 2001. I can't remember exactly if it was June or July, but it was one of the two. I wasn't taking any summer classes that year, nor was my best friend John. Now John had been my buddy since middle school. We went to a southern college that's known for football and parties. That's the most details that I'm gonna give about that. John and I decided that it would be fun to go camping. The weather that weekend was gonna be pretty cool for summer, so I convinced my not very outdoors girlfriend Lauren into coming along. John and his girlfriend Lisa were on board too. Lauren and I had been going out for almost 2 years by this point, so we were pretty close. John had only been dating Lisa for a month at most, and Lauren and I didn't know her very well. It seemed like they were getting serious already, so we figured that this would be a good chance to get to know each other more. Anyways, John's family is pretty country. They always go fishing and hunting and camping. They also own the boat, a little fiberglass skiff with a center console. We decided it would be pretty cool to take the boat out offshore, because there's a lot of small islands nearby that we could have had to ourselves for the whole weekend. The island that we decided on was known by two names. The first is what you'll usually see on charts or maps of the area, and that's Osprey Island. There are most likely 100 Osprey Islands out there, so I'm not too worried about anybody finding out which one I'm talking about. That being said, some of the locals call it the Crab Key, and no, it's not related to the 007 movie. It was part of a small archipelago, but a lot of the other islands were washed away back in the 80s, so Crab Key was a cool little island. It wasn't very big, but it was big enough from one end to the other. You couldn't see the woods to the other side. It was about 2 miles long at the most and only a few hundred feet wide. We loaded up the boat with our tents, sleeping bags, and a couple of coolers. My older brother had bought us some beer, which was pretty exciting at that time, and other necessities. We set out Friday afternoon. Crab Key isn't far offshore, so we got there with plenty of daylight left. We just ran the skiff up on the sand. It was high tide, and since the boat was pretty light, we could push it out into the surf easily. John tossed the anchor out on the beach anyway, just to be safe. John and I had been to the island a few times before, always during the day. We would just explore around the shore a bit and fish, so we knew to pull the boat up near this trail that led to the palmettos. We grabbed the gear and started hiking. Like I said, the island isn't very thick, so it was only about a third of a mile or so from where we had beached to the spot we were planning on setting up camp. Now, in hindsight, I really regret the spot that we decided to post up at, but at that time we didn't think twice about it. You see, the island had been occupied a long time ago by Native Americans. I can't tell you the name of the tribe, that's not what I studied in school, but there were actually quite a lot of Indian tribes throughout the southeastern US in the past, and a lot of them lived on the coast. One of the most common features they left behind are so-called oyster mounds. Basically, it's exactly what it sounds like. They used to eat a lot of oysters, and these oysters have shells. When the Indians lived in one place for a long time, they would make a huge pile of the oyster shells. So that's what people had found in the middle of Crab Key. The mound wasn't big. I suspect that the tribe had lived on the island, but most likely didn't live there full time. Like I said, it wasn't far offshore, so it might have been a seasonal settlement. Anyways, the mound was about 7 feet high and big enough that the four of us, holding hands, only got maybe a quarter of the way around the perimeter. It was the center of a clearing, and it seemed like a cool place to camp, So that's where we ended up setting up. Like I said, I didn't know much about the Indians that made the mound. According to the older kids I knew, like our elder siblings back in the old days, when they were young, you could still sometimes find neat little artifacts in Crab Key. Most of the time like little arrowheads or pottery shards. But apparently, so many generations of teens had gone out to the island to drink or screw everything up. I know we never saw any relics other than the shells. We basically set up camp right next to the mound. John and I each had our own little dome tent, so it was essentially just two tents around a fire pit that we dug in. It was early summer dusk, maybe around 8 o'clock, when we finished our preparations. We had a big pile of fallen pine and a fire going. We had the tents up, and John and Lisa had already popped a couple of Bud Lights. We were just about to settle in for a night of underage drinking when Lauren realized that she had left her inhaler on the boat. Do keep in mind that Lauren had pretty bad asthma. It wasn't bad pollen season at least, but she still didn't like to screw around, especially on an island a good 3 hours away from any hospital. So we had to make sure that her little rescue thing was handy. I told her that I would go get it, but she insisted that she wanted to tag along. I was fine with that, as I figured it would give us some alone time. So we set off down the trail to the shore. It took about less than 10 minutes to stroll from the campsite back to the shore. We grabbed it from the console in the boat, along with her cell phone. None of us had a signal, and it was a very old cell phone. But whatever, I did try to put some moves down and get something going, but I didn't get any further than second base, before suddenly she said that she was feeling creeped out, and wanted to go back to camp. I sighed, and accepted. Like I said, she was not an outdoors kind of girl. It was getting close to dark, and it was very quiet out there except for a few bugs and the lapping of the waves. We got halfway back, right at the point where we couldn't see the shore or camp. It was pretty dark under the trees. All of a sudden, Lauren stops and turns around. Her face is all scrunched up, and just as she opens her mouth to talk, the smell hits me too. Now, I have read all the Goatman stuff and all the stories like that, and it's always described as a weird copper smell, but this wasn't anything close to that. A lot of times, it's hard to describe a weird smell, but this one was pretty clear. It was a distinct body odor. It was as if that one kid that we all knew in school who never showered, or didn't understand what deodorant was.
What the hell is that?
I'm trying to calm down my own breathing. I look around and say, it must be something dead in the bushes. She then says,
Why didn't we smell this when we came by the last couple of times?
I shrugged and pulled my shirt collar up over my nose. She also did the same. I then said, do you want to go look for it? It might be a deer or something. They do swim out to the island sometimes. Lauren then shook her head. She says,
Screw that. Let's just get back to the camp.
She then started jogging towards the camp, and I began to follow. Suddenly, there was some sort of rustling noise coming far from the trail. We both froze, staring towards the shaking plants. Whatever it was quick and retreating, and the sound faded into the brush.
What the hell was that?
Lauren said, It's probably eating something, whatever it is that we're smelling. A possum or something. We stood there for a few seconds, trying to figure out what it was, and then, without saying anything else, we resumed our jog back to camp. After a few minutes, we ran to the bend on the trail and entered a clearing. John was standing by the campfire with his arms up, yelling, Where the hell y'all been at? We were both trying to catch our breath since we jogged back. Where the hell were you guys? He said again. We were taken aback by how agitated he seemed.
What's your problem?
Lauren said. John looked at both of us for a second, wondering why we were both sweaty and assuming that we were doing something else. Then he turned back in the direction that he had been facing a moment ago. I don't know where Lisa went. She said that she needed to pee right after you guys left. He then started taking half steps in a circle, looking out into the now dark woods. It's been half an hour by now. Didn't you guys hear me yelling out for you all? I hadn't even thought of it until just now writing this, but we hadn't. We didn't hear anybody shouting anything at the time, and the island is small enough that you could hear somebody really shouting from anywhere. So that's definitely something weird that I hadn't realized at that time. Anyways, I asked John why he hadn't gone looking for her, and he just shrugged. By now, I had gotten over the creeps of the event back on the trail, so I suggested that Lauren stay in camp and I would go with John to find Lisa. It was only a little spit of sand and we could search the whole place by midnight if we had to. Lucky for us, we didn't have to. We barely left camp in the direction that Lisa had left in when we spotted her. The white t-shirt that she was wearing was easily seen in the dark. She was standing next to a palmetto, but she was also facing away from us towards the opposite shore. John called out to her, but she didn't respond. I called out to her, and nothing. We started walking towards her, calling out to her, but she wouldn't respond. She was just standing there, with her back to us. John and I exchanged looks. We were freaked out, and then we waited. He said her name once more softly before slowly reaching towards her. She jolted and spun around, breathing really hard. John jumped backwards.
John!
She seemed to be surprised.
What the hell? You scared the crap out of me.
We've been calling your name for 30 minutes, and you're standing out here in the dark like a freak, and we scared you? She raised her eyebrows, confused, and shook her head.
I did not. I just came out here to pee.
She looked down. It was only barely noticeable in the dark, but there was an obvious wet stain in her khaki shorts. She stuttered, putting her hands over her mouth. She had peed herself. We all stood there stunned for a few seconds, and then John snapped 2 cents and walked back to her, hugging her. Hey, I don't know what happened, but it's not a big deal. Lisa was speechless. So was I. It was the weirdest thing I ever seen. I started thinking to myself that maybe she had a seizure or something. Meanwhile, Lisa starts crying softly into John's shoulder, and he turns to look at me with his go back to camp while I take care of this look. So I did just that. I only had about 2 minutes to explain to Lauren what happened before they appeared at the edge of the light from the campfire. Lisa was looking at her feet. Her face was still deeply red. But John, without a word, went into their tent and came back out a moment later with some fresh clothes for her. She then went to the other side of the oyster mound, and when she came back, she was wearing some jean shorts and a yellow tank top. I guess she had thrown everything else that she was wearing out into the woods, because she didn't have any of her old clothes anymore. The 3 of us had taken seats around the campfire. All of us were silent, and then she joined us. It took some time, but after we had a few beers, things started to lighten back up again. The mood turned out to be fun. We all got a buzz on, and the rest of the night was what we were hoping for. Jokes, making out, and a lot of bullshitting. I was awoken by John shouting my name. I jerked upright from the deep black sleep of the drunken hangover, gasping for breath the way a drowning man does when pulled above water. John had unzipped our tent and was yelling at me from the entry. Lauren was next to me in the sleeping bag, telling John to shut up. I couldn't even get a word out through my dry mouth, so I waved him off while nodding, trying to signal that I was getting up. John backed off, finally quiet. I put on a shirt and climbed out of the tent into the humid morning air. John was pacing around the blackened remains of our campfire. He came towards me as soon as I was out of the tent. Dude, Lisa is fucking gone again. Nothing was making sense to me yet. I yawned and stretched. Lisa is gone when I woke up. She wasn't there. I had been shouting the whole time. How the hell did you not wake up? I shrugged, still not fully invested in the conversation. I'm not sure what's going on. I do remember saying something half intelligent like, what's her problem? John had already turned around and started into the brush. Come on, dude, we gotta find her. I hesitated for a second and then turned to poke my head back into the tent. I doubt Lauren even heard me, but I told her I was gonna help John find Lisa. She just murmured something in her sleep. It took me a minute to catch up with John, who was moving at a pretty quick pace through the underbrush, yelling for Lisa. I didn't even try to talk when I caught up. I just followed along, looking around us. The island was pretty wide open, nothing but straight trunk pine trees and low scrub, so you can see a pretty long way. It wasn't some twisty narrow old growth forest. Lisa, John was shouting. It seemed pretty silly when I think about it. Like I said, the island was so small that a person standing at one end could likely hear a loud cry from the other end without a problem. How does this girl keep getting lost? John was saying, and I was worried that she most likely had another seizure or some sort of episode, that she could seriously be hurt out there somewhere. This went on for about an hour. We reached one shore, followed it to the tip of the island, and then come back into the woods and follow an overgrown trail all the way back to the fire tip. It was on the far end of the island that we made our first unpleasant discovery. At the fringe of the underbrush, right where it meets the sand of the beach, we found some huge flattened foliage, as if something big had rolled around here to make a bed. But all of the green brush was covered in a spray of tacky reddish-brown blood. There was no doubt about what it was. John and I had both hunted a lot, but there was no doubt that something big had been completely mutilated here. But there was nothing but the tacky spray of blood. No fur, no bones, no half-eaten carcass. We both were thinking the same thing, but none of us could think of anything to say. I'm sure his brain was running the same routine as mine, trying to rationalize it. There's a bobcat or something out here. Sure, there's one of them on this tiny island who eats deer and doesn't leave a scrap of bone. By the way, the air smelled awful. It was already hot, much more hot than the weather report had predicted, and the smell was exactly what you would expect from one of those Goatman stories. But there was no mystical reason for it. No question. The coppery smell of blood. John then gulped down a gag from next to me, so we left. There was no reason to stay. We went back through the woods past the gore-covered matted clearing back towards the camp. John then started getting anxious, and I grew more and more annoyed. I'm not gonna say I wasn't worried. I was. I was really worried about Lisa, but I barely even knew her. And in the past 12 hours, she had mysteriously disappeared twice and was screwing up what was supposed to be a fun weekend. To top it off, she was really freaking me the hell out. So we get back to camp, and guess what we see? I'm sure you already know. Lisa and Lauren are sitting next to the campfire, which is burning again, cooking up some bacon from the cooler. I sighed and said something profane under my breath, but John loses it. He runs into the clearing, like a madman, yelling at Lisa. "Where the hell have you been? We've been shouting for you all morning." Lisa and Lauren look stunned. Lisa just stares at him, silent, eyes wide, but then Lauren jumps up and starts giving it right back.
Why don't you just settle down and quit being a bitch? We haven't heard you shouting anything. Why don't you just relax?
About halfway through her counter assault, she starts looking at me like I had something to do with this. So I'll walk up and put a hand on John's shoulder and give him the kind of quick, calm down lecture that only a close friend can give. Afterwards, he shuts up and sits down next to Lisa. "Sorry, y'all." Lisa nods, so we all sit around the campfire for a bit. We eat some bacon except for Lisa, who takes her share and just stares at it some more. Just a whole awkward silence. Then Lauren grabs my shoulder and gives me a...
Hey, let's go somewhere private.
We make our excuse to John and Lisa, and we head into the woods on the far side of the oyster mound. We get a few hundred yards down the trail when Lauren spins around to face me.
What the hell is up with them?
She says, "I'm not ready," and just throw out my hands in a, I don't know what's going on with them.
First, she disappears last night. Then you guys disappear this morning, and she hasn't said a word since I got her out of the tent.
I'm just shaking my head at this point, having no idea what's going on. Hold on, John woke me up because Lisa was missing this morning, and we just spent the last couple of hours going all around trying to find her. And then we find you guys making breakfast like nothing ever happened. Now it was Lauren's turn to look confused for a second.
I got up after you left and she was in the tent. I woke her up, got the fire going, and we've been sitting there awkward as hell because she won't say anything.
And then we looked at each other for a long moment. "This is really messed up," I said after a long silence. She nodded, digesting her own thoughts.
I want to go home,
Lauren said. Part of me wanted to disagree, wanted to be a man and chalk it all up to the silliness and get our weekend back on track. But all I did was nod. "Alright," I said. We headed back to camp. John and Lisa are sitting right where we left them, still silent. For some reason, I feel like I need to explain to John what Lauren and I have been talking about, so I asked John if he could come down to the boat with me to get some stuff we left there. John agrees, and we head off. 10 minutes later, we're standing by the boat, which is resting completely on the damp low tide shore, a good 10 feet from the shallow landing water. So John, look man, Lauren and I think that we should leave as soon as we can. Huh? John responds. How come? Why does your girlfriend keep disappearing? John started shaking his head. F you man, that's not cool. I then said, look, I don't know what happened last night, but I'm thinking that she's having some sort of mental episodes or something. I'm not sure, but it doesn't matter. We stared at each other for a few seconds. Lauren said that Lisa was inside your tent after we left. Are you sure she was? You know, gone? Trying to make sense of the situation. Are you kidding? I think I can tell if there's a second person in my effing tent, dude. Lauren just said after we left she got up and Lisa was sleeping inside your tent. I don't know what's going on, but I agree with Lauren that we should just call this a weekend and go back. John was shaking his head, trying to figure out what he wanted to say, when I saw his eyes focus on something behind me and widen. I turned and immediately saw what had caught his attention. The plastic housing had been yanked off of the outboard motor on the boat. The clips that held it in place had been snapped off. The motor had been brutalized, vandalized, really. The spark plug wires were yanked out, ripped, and torn apart from the plug heads. Much of the other wiring was ripped to pieces. The prop was completely gone, as well as the pin. It took a few seconds to sink in just how screwed we suddenly were. At the same time, we both said, what the fuck, before either of us had a chance to fully process what we were looking at. A piercing scream that echoed out in the woods behind us, coming from the camp. Without a thought, we took off down the trail in a dead sprint. We found Lauren sitting in the middle of the trail, 100 feet or so from the bend that entered the clearing. She was on her knees, knuckles in her mouth, hyperventilating. She looked at us as we ran up to her, eyes confused and panicked. I fell to my own knees next to her, putting my hands on her shoulders. I shook her and called her name. She blinked a few times, her eyes seeming to focus. I then said, "What is it? What is it?" She just shook her head and pointed. Right next to the edge of the trail were a pair of jean shorts and a yellow tank top, and they were stained dark red. "What the fuck?" John said, moving towards them for a closer look. Lauren then said,
I was coming out to use the bathroom.
she said to my ear,
I was coming back to camp.
and she just started crying. "What are you guys doing? What's going on, dude?" John said from behind me, "This belongs to Lisa." We stared at each other. None of us could think of anything to say.
I want to go home.
I promised her that we would go soon, but we had to pack up. She looked very unhappy, but nodded. I helped her back to her feet, and we tromped through the pine needles back to camp. I actually didn't have the heart to tell her about the boat. We get back to camp, and Lisa is just sitting calm by the dead campfire. John then runs over to her, almost as if he's surprised to see her still in one piece, and takes her into his arms and starts whispering into her ear. Lauren and I can see from his face that he's going to pieces, but he seems to be doing his best, most likely to comfort and get through Lisa. We are both just glad that she is, in fact, in one piece. We stand awkwardly at the edge of camp for a bit, watching John whisper reassurances to Lisa. Eventually, I decide that I need to fill Lauren on the boat situation, so I lead her a bit away and tell her what we seen. I was expecting a level of freaking out, but she actually took it more calm than me or John. She said, as a matter of fact,
It must have been an animal. Raccoons tear stuff up all the time.
there was no questioning in her voice. I then nodded. You're most likely right. It only took a second to convince myself it was most likely a raccoon. Keep in mind, I had in fact experienced many raccoon issues many times in my life, and they can actually cause some pretty serious damage if they want to get in or out of something. It wasn't hard to make me believe it. I debated with myself whether to tell Lauren about the bloody mess that we had also found, but decided that she was taking things way too well, and that there was no reason to screw that up. So we spent a few minutes talking about strategies to get home. She asked if John and I could fix the boat. I said, Most likely not. She asked if we could swim to shore. I said, maybe, if we were desperate. She checked her phone for signal. Of course it didn't have any. We were still brainstorming options. None of them were already planned out. When John found us, he said, "Guys, I'm worried about Lisa. That got both of our attention. She won't say anything," he said. He was looking at the ground. "I don't know what to do." Lauren nodded.
She wouldn't talk to me this morning. I'm worried too. Maybe she really did have some kind of seizure or something. Has she ever said anything about like medical stuff or anything like that?
Lauren sounded almost hopeful for an answer that made sense. "No, she hasn't," said John, shaking his head. "I mean, nothing like this. I don't know what to do." We spent some time in a little circle talking about our escape plan, but there was nothing really great that came to mind. Again, the island wasn't terribly far from shore. John and I were strong swimmers. If we got really desperate, we could make it. The water was very shallow in places, and full of sharp as hell oyster bars and potentially swarming with bull sharks. So that was an option that we weren't freaked out enough to really use yet. It was maybe around 11 o'clock, maybe closer to noon. It was hot as hell, tons of biting flies, and no sense of fun. Nobody wanted to go swimming to cool off. Nobody wanted to tell jokes. It was just the three of us trying to make stiff conversation, while Little Miss Sunshine was sitting there dead silent. There were a few moments when Lisa would look up at one of us suddenly and just stare, but mostly she just kept her eyes locked dead on the fire. Imagine that, camping with a group of friends, and one of them is just staring directly at a fire, not saying a word, for hours. At one point, John left to go work on the boat. I was gonna go too, but Lauren made it clear that she didn't want to be alone there. There was no reason to point out that she wasn't alone. She would be with Lisa, but it didn't need to be said. John was gone for an hour or two, and he came back looking pretty rejected. I knew that was coming. The motor was trashed, so the afternoon passed by with the three of us basically just trying to figure out what to do. I mean, looking back, I'm thinking the same thing anybody else is reading this. Why aren't you guys building a raft, making shelter, tying up Lisa so that she doesn't disappear again? I know, but we were young, and again, nothing really outright crazy was going on when you think about it. We were somewhere in between calm and panic. The twilight starts to come on, and we spent the entire day doing basically nothing. At one point, Lauren and I went and gathered more firewood, so we were set for the night around 6 o'clock. John led Lisa by the hands to the tent and laid her down. I remember looking at her through the round door just before John zipped it up. She was laying on her back like a dead person, except she had her eyes wide open, staring at the roof of the tent, very stiff. With Lisa in the tent, we started talking normally again. We got the fire going, and as twilight was coming on, we popped a few more beers and, at least for a little bit, forgot about the obvious problems and started having some fun. I mean, the boat was weird, but it was probably just a raccoon. We were easily within reach of land if it came to that, and it probably wouldn't because there were usually a lot of local traffic around the bay, checking crab traps or fishing or even just coming to the island to hang out. As for the blood, I convinced myself it was just some sort of animal, maybe a bobcat, right? And Lisa, even though she's been acting weird as shit, she was most likely asleep in the tent and not actively bringing us down. This whole good moment lasted well until full past dark. I don't know what time exactly, but it had been dark a while. John gets up to go use the bathroom. He was only gone a few paces before he stopped. "Guys," I remember he said. Lauren and I turned around, both mid-laugh. The smiles drained from our faces like something you would see in a movie. Guys? The door to John's tent was unzipped wide open. The tent was empty.
You've got to be fucking kidding me,
Lauren said. We both got up instantly. John was in his tent looking for a flashlight. A moment later, I was in my backpack grabbing the battery lanterns that I had brought. I handed one to Lauren, who hesitated a few seconds to grab it. She obviously knew what it meant, and she didn't like it. "We gotta go find her," I said. Lauren just stared at me wide-eyed and shook her head. How the hell did she unzip the tent and leave without any of us noticing? John said. His voice sounded urgent. He was shining his mag light in random directions, the white light cutting through the dark woods. Alright, we're gonna split up, he said. Fuck that, I said. That was my instant reply. I don't know if you ever seen a scary movie before, John, but there's no way I'm gonna leave Lauren alone, or you alone, and there's no way I'm going out there alone either. My speech was definitely not that sane. So John formed up with us, and as a small triangle of bodies and flashlights, we set out down the weedy trail that started nearest to the tent. We searched for a while, with all of our arms pretty much lean, eyes facing every direction. We had grown up on Scooby-Doo, and we weren't gonna let anybody fall through a trap door or any kind of reversible bookshelf or anything. When we first left camp, we were shouting Lisa's name, but after 10 minutes, we just gave up. She would have heard us by now, but she wasn't answering, so we just started searching in silence, waiting for that one moment in a scary movie when the cat is leaping out of the closet while the guy with the hatchet is under the bed. Anyways, we worked our way around pretty much the entire island. If it was hypothetically midnight when we started looking, it was most likely 3 or 4 in the morning. I could tell from the sky that dawn was a while off. We then realized that we came around to the boat. Lauren breaks from the group for a bit and goes over to the boat. John and I, who are still peering into the woods, hear her gasp. We both look back. Our nerves were pretty raw. And Lauren's gasp is the first human noise that we heard in 2 hours. She raises an arm to shield her eyes from the flashlight beams that we leveled on her. Then she points towards the boat. No fucking way, John groaned. The fiberglass had all been scratched with deep gouges and shadow lines etched into every surface of the boat. The cushions of the seats were shredded. Fiber padding was everywhere. We ran the lights over the exterior of it, looking at the deep marks in the material. It seemed like there were almost patterns in there, but they weren't patterns. I wish I could say something really spooky like there were cave drawings of 666, or some kind of skulls or crossbones or something, but it wasn't. It was just like a 3-year-old scribbling in a coloring book, and then we also noticed a broken oyster shell spread around the boat. It was somewhere between low and high tide, so water was lapping at the stern of the boat. In the damp sand were dozens of broken shells, many with curls of plastic and fiberglass stuck to the sharp tips. I remember Lauren then started crying. I put my arm around her and pulled her close. I remember her face turning red, her eyes pink, tears pooling and running down her cheeks. John wasn't doing any better. He had returned his flashlight beam to the woods and was whipping it around without any purpose. Panic was obvious. I was still sitting in it too, but I guess I was just in a slightly better headspace than my friends. That's when John screamed, and then Lauren screamed. John's flashlight beam had stopped, and it was illuminating Lisa. She was on the edge of the trees, her face pale, her hair messy and tangled, pine straw and twigs all through it. In response to John and Lauren's screams, Lisa began screaming as well. I don't know how the hell I was able to hold it together, but I recall thinking something kind of silly like, well, at least she's talking again. I know this might sound like a funny scene, especially because John and Lauren started screaming, and then creepy as hell Lisa started screaming too, and then they were all screaming. I started shaking Lauren by her shoulders. She dropped her lantern to the ground. John had gotten himself under control, as had Lisa, apparently, because next thing you know, it was silent. The only sound was the lapping of waves hitting against the shore. At this point, I want to make another comment. I can't believe we didn't think about it then, but I also realized my mind wasn't exactly functioning in a logical way. Maybe John or Lauren noticed it, but they never mentioned it to me. Lisa was at this point wearing the same khaki shorts and the same white t-shirt that she was wearing when we first arrived. The actual shorts that she had peed herself in. The outfit that she changed out of the very first night. Only now, looking back, do I realize that she had been wearing that when John and I first came back from the boat. The bloody clothes that we found on the trail. Those were the clothes that she changed into the first night in the woods. I know this might sound kind of confusing, but some of this just now seems so obvious to me. But now, Lisa starts gasping and crying, and then she starts sobbing. John then runs over to her and wraps her arm around her. She does the same. They're wrapped in each other's embrace. How romantic. Lisa then starts saying,
What's happening?
Lauren and I turn to face each other, both speechless, when from the woods nearly rips this loud screeching sound. John and I are both pretty woodsy, John more than I, but we're both campers, and we're both hikers. He hunts with his family a lot, and we were both stricken with fear by this sound, the sound that we never heard before. I can't even really describe it, but I'll try. It sounds like, if you ever heard raccoons mating, they make this wild high-pitched sort of screech. So combine that with the fake sounds of Bigfoot groans that you see from those awful Animal Planet specials, and maybe like the sound of the T-Rex from Jurassic Park, and you can kind of imagine this type of sound that I'm talking about. I know it's not really accurate, but it's the best that I can do. The four of us freeze. John and I, the only two still holding flashlights, spin to face the sound, but there's nothing there. I then hear Lauren say,
Oh God,
from beside me. The screech comes again, this time closer. John, who's holding Lisa by the shoulder, starts to back up towards Lauren and me. We are closer to the boat. I then hear John saying something under his breath. Finally, the screech comes again, and this time, it was close. There's a crazy commotion from the underbrush. Something is definitely coming towards us now, and it's coming fast. John then turns around, holding Lisa by her shoulder, and then starts to run, trying to close the 50-odd feet between us. Me and Lauren do the same, and we start running for the boat. Now, I have no idea why we all decided to run for the boat. The motor was dead as dirt, but hey, we weren't really thinking in that moment. So I'm basically throwing Lauren into the boat when I hear the muffled scuff of something hitting beach sand. I turn and see that John and Lisa have fallen onto the beach. John's flashlight has tumbled away from him. At the same time, Lauren slips onto the wet fiberglass of the boat and falls down, taking my flashlight with her. This is the point that I still find hard to believe or remember, but I'm gonna type out the first things that come to mind and trust to be accurate as possible. I'm looking at the vague dark forms of John and Lisa laying on the ground, maybe 20 feet away from the boat. The moon is pretty dark, maybe a quarter moon. From the brush and scrub emerges this shape. It's human, but not right. It's hard to describe, except, well, Lauren and I saw a movie a year later that really helped. I remember when it appeared on screen for the first time. It brought flashbacks and Lauren and I simply stood up and left. It was actually one of the last times that Lauren and I saw each other. The movie was Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers, and of course, the character was Gollum. The shape was, like I said, humanoid. It almost shimmered in the faint moonlight. It padded across, four-legged like an animal, but very awkward. I looked with wide eyes as it beeline for John's falling flashlight. It leaped upon it like a cat on a bird, and it began working on it, grasping it and beating it into the shore again and again. This all happened in the blink of an eye. John, staring at this occurring only a few feet from where he was laying, was able to pull himself together and drag Lisa back up, half running, half crawling to the boat. I helped them toss Lisa in, and together we began pushing, trying to get back into the deeper water. I didn't look back at whatever was happening on the shore, but this thing was squealing now. I could still hear the thumping of the light hitting the dense wet sand, and there was the light itself. Of course, the beam of light was slicing up and down towards us, illuminating the boat, and then up into the sky and then back down. Then, nothing. It went dark, and immediately the sound stopped. John and I had succeeded in getting the entire boat back into the water, but it was still very shallow. Our feet were wet, but the water wasn't even up to our ankles. The girls were now screaming from where they were laying on the boat, and then the thing screamed from behind us as well. It was terrifying before from the woods, but it was far worse when the thing was screeching down the backs of our shirts. I turned to look, and what I saw, well, I don't have any trouble remembering. I don't even need any help to describe it. It looked like a silverback gorilla, not so thick, but the same pose. It rested with its legs hunched low, two stringy muscular arms beating the sand around it in a rage. I couldn't really see the face. It was dark, but I was struck by a sense of humanity. There were 2 eyes, there was a nose, and there was a mouth. Everything was so distorted. Anyways, it screeched again, and it seemed ready to charge at us. What I did next was purely a reflex. I reached down into the boat and yanked from beneath the body of my terrified girlfriend the lantern that she had pulled from my hands. At that time, I meant to throw it at that thing, but I missed, and I missed bad. The lantern went past its shoulder and landed with a puff on the sand at the edge of the beach. This thing, it sniffed the air, then it turned, and just like that, it went after the light. John and I couldn't move for a few moments, but the urgency of the moment took over again. We both started shoving the boat again. Finally, there was a squeak, and the boat was free of the sand. We pushed more, forcing it into the deep water. Then we both climbed in and turned and watched. We could still see the movement of the lantern, just a beam of light being pounded against the sand. Occasionally, we would hear a squeal or a groan from the thing on the beach. Finally, after 30 or 40 seconds, the light flickered and went black. Then, there was silence. The only sound was the lapping of water against the side of the boat. Lucky for us, the current was taking us away from the island. We drifted for a few hours before the sun started to come up. By then, we were close enough to the mainland to entertain the idea of swimming in. However, Lisa was pretty much out of it. She was talking and crying, but nobody thought it was a good idea to put her in the water, so we waited. Eventually, we drifted near another boat, a fishing boat out with a client. We made up some story to him. I'm sure he just assumed that we were some dumb drunk kids who got lost and almost died of a heat stroke. Either way, he told us in. And that's basically the whole story. Like I said, we told plenty of people. It wasn't some great secret among us, but not one person ever believed us. Lisa and John broke up almost instantly. They didn't even really break up. John just never saw or spoke to her ever again. Lauren and I lasted a little longer. We just stopped talking about the event one day, until that night at the movies. I drove her home. We talked a few times on the phone, but we never saw each other again. And then years go by, decades, and some stupid stories on the internet stir all of this back up. Even just sitting here after I typed all this out, I keep telling myself that this sounds crazy, like it was just some cracked out homeless bum, or an island person, or a hermit. There were even times when I hoped that the whole thing was my older siblings playing some kind of prank, but it wasn't. This whole thing really did happen. None of us really ever spoke to Lisa again, as far as I know. Anyways, after Lauren and I split up, we never had contact. She transferred to a school in California. John's story is even more sad. He sort of dropped out right after all this happened. He never went back to school in the fall. We hung out every now and then, but slowly he just stopped returning phone calls and emails. Eventually, he just fell off the radar. The last thing I heard from him was from his mom. A few years after all this happened, he just moved out and didn't leave any contact information. Ever since then, in the modern age of the internet, I sometimes look for him now and then on Facebook or LinkedIn, Twitter, things like that, but I never seen any sign of him. I do worry about my friend though, and I'm still not sure what even happened back there. I think there is something living or walking around in my ex-best friend's skin. I will tell the tale and the nopes that led up to it. It was July last year. Me and my friend are both 18, decided to go camping for a week. End up not liking any of the lame, paid campsites. We are doing this the old way, goddammit. Illegally camping in this amazing area. Far away from houses and properties. The nearest town is at least half an hour drive away. Fuck snakes and spiders. We're both Australian. The first few days of camping are great though. It was pretty rainy. Every night we end up talking for hours and being hilarious. Then go to sleep in a massive swag that I brought. The place is great, but for some reason we stick together. It made me uneasy to be alone, and for some reason, we always made sure we were within viewing distance of one another. One night, we ended up huddled in fear. We could hear something walking around the fucking swag. Walks around us for hours while we both nope the fuck out of there. Then we hear a fucked up screech from a distance. Noise like wind going past really fast and footsteps stomping. We're camped in a clearing. No wind can get through the trees like that. It hasn't this whole time. My friend then starts laughing. Holy fuck, man. That was scary as fuck. We end up eventually going to sleep. The next day I'm cooking. Oh shit, we need more firewood. Can't leave this food because it'll burn really fast. My friend volunteers. First time one of us has gone into the wooded area alone. My friend pauses before going in. Finally summons some fucking courage and disappears from sight. I'm a fucking master chef. Not wearing my watch, but it's been like an hour. I'm nearly done cooking the stuff. I assume he's taking a shit, so I'll give that fucker some privacy. The fire begins to fail, so I have to ninja get some wood and finish the meal. Eventually, I realize maybe some inbred fuckers have raped and ate my friend. Damn it, I spent ages cooking this meal. I grab my big ass knife, rifle, torch, and a bite of my delicious damper. I walk into the woods yelling for my friend, but I feel something watching me. I begin to get scared, but I'm not about to admit it. Come out, you fucker. It doesn't take that long to shit. Then I see someone in the woods in front of me. And then I hear my friend laugh. But at the same time, I hear a screech behind me. Oh, fuck that. I started running straight towards where I saw my friend. That fucker is unarmed. As I'm running, I lose sight of my friend. I called out to him, "Motherfucker, if you're dead, I will kill you." I end up breaking through the wooded area into a padlock. I see something move in the woods across the padlock. It looks big. Bigger than me. I start to consider how many bullets I have. Probably not enough. I run back through the woods to get to the campsite. And my friend is sitting there, wearing a change of clothes. Holy fuck, man. That was scary as fuck. He laughs. Oh wait, did you hear the screech? He shakes his head. Fuck, I must be paranoid. So we dig into some delicious food. I tell him about the huge thing that I saw, and he just starts laughing again and says, I wouldn't worry about it. That night, I'm sitting across from my friend in front of a fire. I decided to teach myself whittling, so I start to whittle away. I cut my thumb. I stick a band-aid on that shit and continue to whittle. He's reading a book and has a little light with him. The wood start rustling and shit. The crickets start chirping, but they start chirping away. My friend then starts to laugh at something that he's reading. Then I think about his laugh in the woods. I realize it's the same exact laugh as the one when the thing walked around the swag. The same laugh that he did just then. Same as the first thing he said when I found him with different clothes on back at the camp. He also said the same words. Weird. I eventually decide to drink a bit, but he's a lightweight. We both crawl into the swag laughing. I have the knife attached to my belt. Then, at some point in the night, I wake up and I find him staring at me. My drunk brain suddenly worried that he might be going homo for a second while drunk. I start to talk about this girl that I really like. He seems to be really aware and listening to everything I say. Suddenly, I feel like my bladder is gonna burst. I stagger out this little river that goes past our campsite. I take a piss in the early morning light while I'm in awe of the majesty of nature. That's when I see something gray sticking out of the riverbed. I go over and pull it out. It's the shirt that my friend was wearing yesterday before going into the woods. It's torn up pretty bad, with a little bit of blood on it. But I'm too drunk to really put anything together. I rebury it, because my drunk brain thinks putting the cotton back to nature to decompose is a great idea. I clean my hands on my pants. I climb back into the swag. And I realize that my friend is fucking gone to La La Land. I pass out and wake up a couple of hours later. My friend is still asleep. I begin to have a feeling about weird shit that's been happening. I realize that the fire needs restarting, while pushing the coals and ashes around to add more wood. I find the button of the pants that he was wearing yesterday, and a bit of a gray cotton fabric, like the stuff from his shirt. What the fuck? Today is the day we pack up and leave. When my friend wakes up, he's being as weird as he was yesterday. I start to pack, and he gives me a weird look, so I just tell him to start helping me. He then gets to asking if I can go get some firewood because he's hungry. I tell the bitch once we're done packing, I hold his hand and go into the woods with him. Once we packed up, we both carry shit up to the car, which is hidden up near the bush track to get out of here. I check my car every day, and he follows the whole way because the dumb fuck has probably forgotten where it's at. We load up the car. I turn it on to make sure it's all good. I'm able to tune the radio, but there's a weather warning about storms hitting the area. We go back to the campsite to grab the last stuff. Can we go get firewood now? He asked. My friend is standing just inside the edge of the woods. Suddenly, I get this feeling deep in my stomach, like fear or something. I really want to get the fuck out of here. Nah, I don't think so. There's a weather warning. We can eat some food we got left over, and we'll buy something hot when we hit the next town. It's an 8-hour drive home. While I finish up packing, he doesn't even eat anything, but the fucker has been acting weird. I then ask him if he's alright. Yeah, I'm fine. Are you sure we can't stay another night though? I don't think the storm is gonna hit here. That's when I see something move in the woods behind him. What the fuck is that? He doesn't turn around. I pull out my knife and for some reason he goes almost into a defensive pose. He gives me a weird look. Dude, there was something fucking behind you. He turns around and says, I'm sure it was nothing. While we walk up to the car, he looks behind us a few times. So I'm trying to act normal because he sure isn't. So when I was cleaning up the fire, I noticed bits of your clothes in there. He says he wrecked them while collecting firewood and didn't want to add to the rubbish to bring back. Fucking weirdo, dude. He never done shit like that before. He shrugs and looks around as we get up to the car. That's when I feel like something is watching me. But once we're in the car and back out the road, I started to feel better. I keep trying to make conversation, but he doesn't put much into the conversation. I turn on the radio. Every so often he repeats things some of the radio presenters say. While we aren't talking, I have time to think about it. Him not worry about anything is what starts to worry me. I start to think about the weird looks he's been giving me in different situations. I feel sick and horrified, and I realize the faces are most likely the faces I was putting at him at those moments. He's been mimicking my expressions. Realize he's been repeating phrases I say, and his laugh doesn't even change. His clothes all torn up and him trying to bury them, finding them burnt after I found them, wanting me to go back into the creepy fucking woods for some reason. I decide to give a little test, talk about some stupid shit we did as kids. So I start to ask questions, and he just says, "Oh, I don't remember that part," or just simply agrees with me. The more I think about it, I start to realize that he hasn't been acting like himself at all since he went missing while I was cooking. When we finally get to a town, I turn my phone on and I call my mom. She's glad we had fun and stuff. She can't wait for us to get back into town and spend some time with her before I go back to work. I ask him if he's gonna call his parents, and he gives me a weird look again. Then he gets his phone from his backpack. I then grab money from our joint cash fund and buy us both lunch. He eats the almost raw steak from his burger, but doesn't want his chips or the rest of the bun or salad. He then goes in. He then comes out with 2 more big pieces of red steak. Done. Rare. He starts to wolf those fuckers down while I finish my meal. He then pulls out his phone again and fires off some texts. That's when I notice some wicked bruises covering his upper arms. What the fuck happened there, man? He shrugs and says that they don't hurt. Well, okay then. I then change clothes and shower there. And he is waiting by the car. I notice him staring and watching other people. And he says he doesn't want to shower. I call him a smelly fucker and he disappears for a bit. He comes back with new clothes. And he even smells like he took a shower. So then we keep on driving. And it's now nighttime. Only an hour or 2 out away from home. He slowly begins to join in the conversation, but he doesn't sound the same as he used to. None of his speech habits are the same. No talking about the girl he's crazy about. I decide to bring up the creepy shit that happened out at the campsite. I swear, I thought about shooting that horse or whatever that big thing was out there. But I decided I like my chances of not knowing. And he starts to laugh and says, I wouldn't worry about that. I begin to feel uneasy and think that maybe this isn't my friend next to me anymore. What about that thing that walked around our tent? He gives me this weird smile. Maybe it was a werewolf. I laugh. Or a hot chick who was lost. He grins wider. Or maybe something that was just checking us out. I then feel weird again. So I force a laugh. Why would anything do that? Like some cannibal or rapist? He looks out the window. And I can't watch him because I gotta keep my eyes on the road. Maybe they wanted to get out of there. As badly as you did this morning, he says. What the fuck did he just say? I glance at him, but he's not looking at me. I can feel my knife on my hip in its holster. The rifle stored away in the back. Like a Skinwalker or some shit. Something like that, he says. We both go silent. Then he starts to laugh. And it's the same fucking laugh. But that would be impossible, right? I laugh. The radio goes on, and we don't even talk for the rest of the drive. I get to his house. I start to help him get his shit out of my car, and then I drive home. As I get inside, I start to shake. I'm a man, for fuck's sake. Keep it together, motherfucker. Seriously, I think my friend died out there, and there is something else living inside of him now. Not only this, but weird shit has been happening. Like his dog and cat have mysteriously disappeared. He doesn't even hang out with us as much anymore. And even the girl he liked tried to hang out with him and she says he was really fucking weird. He apparently acts almost robotic and only eats hardly cooked meat like a fucking caveman. His mom even asked him if he had gotten into any fights because his skin is always bruised. Now he could have joined a fight club or something, but honestly, my best friend is a totally different guy now. The craziest thing is that he recently invited me to go camping again, to the same fucking spot. I had to say I was busy, but I'm terrified that maybe there was more than one, and when he tried to get me to go out into the woods with him, he was trying to draw me out there for the same thing to happen to me. This shit's so fucked. I ignore his calls now, and whenever I get back from a swing at work, all I get is complaints about his weird behavior, and people asking if he's on drugs or some shit. For God's sake, I told my friends to never take him up on a camping idea, and I told the girl I liked, who is now my girlfriend, that all this weird shit that's happened, and she agrees that he is a totally different person. He was a stand-up guy who was hilarious and laid back, and now he is almost malicious and uncaring, and sometimes I can hear that fucking laugh in my head and that fucking screech, and it sucks. Being terrified of some asshole that I used to love like my own brother. And so this concludes this fucked up story of me being convinced that my friend is no longer human or who he used to be. I have never in my life seen anyone change like that. Some days I just fucking nope the whole thing and hope that I'm just crazy and that he's just gone on some sort of hardcore drugs. I should have asked him things that only he would know. Lie about something. Make him agree with you. And there you go. A better way to tell. Or just come clean with everything and see if he admits it in arrogance. That's pretty much what I did, and that's what set it off for me. The stupid shit we did as kids was like putting this purple goo into these girls' hair. He loves to tell that story because in order to get rid of the blame on us, we put it in our own hair so we wouldn't get in trouble, and they wouldn't tell. While we were driving, I asked him if he remembered putting goo into girls' hair. He said yes. I asked him if he remembered if it was green, or blue, or purple, and he said he didn't remember, but was pretty sure it was green. Now, there is no fucking way he forgot. No fucking way. He fucking told that story a couple of weeks before we went down there. I also decided to ask him about his first dog, Mo. He didn't remember shit about Mo. In fact, it made me so fucking sick of his vague fucking responses that I stopped before he realized I was getting upset. And God knows what would have happened if it realized what I was doing. But I assume it can read, and it also learns very fast, like his phone. When I told him to call his parents, he treated his phone like he had no fucking idea. But then, by the time that I bought food, he was already texting people, and then how he was copying my expressions and other people's and the radio's talk. It was so fucking scary, man. Maybe it makes me an asshole for being willing to drop a friendship that I had pretty much my whole life over these experiences. But honestly, what am I supposed to do? Hello, officers. When I was on a camping trip with my best friend last year, we spent a good amount of the time drinking and camping on illegal ground. I'm pretty sure something ate the insides of my friend, and is now wearing him as a meat suit. You can just imagine the laugh that I would get, right? From what I know, he hasn't attacked anyone physically or asked anyone else to go camping with him. So be careful if somebody ever goes into the woods and they come back a different person. I never told this story to anyone, and I don't really intend to tell it again. I have a pounding migraine today, and this thread has kept me good company as I drifted in and out. I actually don't like talking about this time in my life. When I was around 12, I lived with my mom. We were below the poor level. We lived up in the mountains around Santa Cruz, California. My mom had a friend that owned a large bit of property up there, and he let us stay in a trailer up there. Our trailer was very small and was right beside a garden. A chain link fence ran around the garden to keep the dog the owner had out, along with other animals. All kinds of deer and things are very common in the area. Also, along the fence area was a single room. It was like a tiny house, but it was only a single room on the inside. This room had light, and since our actual trailer didn't, I spent a lot of my time in there. By the way, sorry that the story will be fairly long. I'm actually pretty bad at writing. I just want to say that first, as this will be the only time. So there's this one thing you should know right now. This small fenced-in area was only a small part of the property, but most of it was just a bunch of woods. Also, I refused to leave the fence area because the owner's dog had been mistreated by children in the past and was very sketchy towards me all the time. If I was alone, it would try to bite at me, even through the fence. The fence was tall, at least 7 feet high, and wasn't even movable. So as long as the gate was closed, I was safe. With that being said, there is no one else around us for miles and miles. Now I'm telling you all this because I think it's important that you understand what kind of scene this was before I really get into the story. So we have a fenced-in location that seems fairly safe. It contains a trailer and a single room with power that is not connected to the trailer. Nothing else around for miles. My mom's van is parked out in front of the gate to the fenced-in area, and a single unpaved road runs from this garden for about a mile to the main house. Now then, I would bring friends up there to sleep over here and there. We all thought it was pretty cool, you know. Besides, we would get our own room to stay in, to play video games all night long. It was like a dream come true. The only downside was simple. When it would get dark outside, it would get really dark. No city around, and the trailer would not be lit up. There was no bathroom to use in the room, and you would have to walk through the dark garden in order to get to the trailer to use it. Strange things would happen out here from time to time. It was always something that could be somewhat easily explained away though. Noises like people working at night, or once me and a friend were sitting out in the garden and we saw a shadow as big as a small bear bound up a tree, but the tree didn't shake like there was weight on it. The dog also creeped me out, but you know, angry dog, and I was a kid. It happens. Now, I do get scared pretty fast. I always been that way. For example, I have trouble walking through a lit house if I'm alone. My friends, however, tend to be more outgoing, just the kinds of people I get along with. This time, I had a friend over. His name was Jacob. We were staying up all night and playing Sonic the Hedgehog 3 on my Sega Genesis. We started playing as the sun went down, and by the time we were finishing up the game, it was around 2 a.m. That's when we heard it. We turned off the game, getting ready to find something else to play. There was a rumbling in the woods behind the room we were in, like somebody was rolling something really heavy around. We hadn't heard it before, because the noise from what we were playing was loud. I immediately got goosebumps. Jacob was not really worried about it, but it's not like there was someone else's house a yard right over there. It was just a forest for miles, and it sounded like someone was constructing something or some shit, dragging and rolling something really heavy. Eventually, Jacob convinced me to just play some more games. I agreed on the condition that we turn the volume down so we could hear if something happened. We started playing, and I didn't even notice that the noise had stopped because I was into the game. A couple hours later, Jacob said he had to use the bathroom. I was feeling fine by then, so I was fine when he left to the trailer to relieve himself. He was taking a while, so eventually, I decided I was going to go check on him. Besides, I could use the bathroom and grab a snack while I was at it. I got up and opened the door to leave, and when I opened it, he was just standing at the doorway, right outside the door, facing it. It scared the shit out of me. That's when I asked what he was doing, and he just stood there, blocking the exit. I realized he must have sneaked up to the door because I could hear him walk away from the room, but I hadn't heard him walk back up to it. It was super quiet out there, without the noises of the city. I should have been able to hear, but he refused to say anything or respond. He just stood there. I told him he was really creeping me out, but it wasn't like him to try to scare me like this. Finally, I decided to just go to the trailer and use the bathroom myself. I told him what I was gonna do. Then I moved past him, but when I pushed him out of my way a little, his skin felt freezing to the touch. I jumped a little, but it was a cold night, and he had been standing out there for like 30 minutes, so I figured that was to be expected. I walked as quickly as I could over to the trailer, and that's when he followed me, like, right on my tail. It was unnerving. I joked a little, saying that he already surprised me by scaring me at the door. The joke is over already. Finally, I got to the trailer and walked in. He didn't follow. He just stayed at the doorway. Now, I want you to picture this. Imagine inside a trailer with the door open in the middle of the night and your friend is just standing outside a trailer looking in. I checked on my mom, who was fast asleep. Then, I turned to go into the bathroom. It was a porta potty, and we keep the bathroom door shut because it smells bad. When I reached for the door and tried to open it though, it was locked. That's when I heard a nervous voice come from behind the door. In here. I quickly turned to look at Jacob, but the door was still open and there was nothing there but pitch black night. I froze. I would have heard the bathroom door open if he had come in behind me and gone that way. There is no way to do it quietly. That's when I just yelled out so loud that my mom woke up. I stared at the doorway, unable to bring myself to move a muscle. She got up, walked over there, and looked out. Not seeing anything, she closed the door and asked me what was wrong. By now, Jacob was coming out of the bathroom and acting perfectly normal, but just a little bit confused. I explained what happened, and Jacob said he was just taking a long time in the bathroom, basically. None of them believed me at all, no matter how much I insist. My mom is sure that I just got sleepy and imagined it, and Jacob thought I was trying to prank him. So my mom gets out a big flashlight and walks us back to the room. She tells us to go to sleep, then she leaves and goes back to the bed herself. Now, this room doesn't have any windows or anything, so after a while, I calm back down a little bit. I'm telling myself that my mom was right. It must have been like a waking dream or something. Meanwhile, Jacob insists that he was in the bathroom the whole time, and I'm inclined to believe him, because there is just no way to really get around without being heard. So I settled down, but I'm a little rattled, but I'm thinking that I can just sleep it off throughout the night. Suddenly, the dog starts going nuts, right behind us. The room is up against the fence, so the dog must have been like right behind the room on the other side. I guess when the dog started going nuts, I got scared, because Jacob started laughing at me and said, "The dog barking at a squirrel or some shit, and you're over here shitting yourself." It keeps going like that for a long time though. Suddenly, the barking stops and gets replaced by whimpering. We hear the dog run away. There's about 45 seconds of silence before we hear something new. A small stretching sound on the back wall of the room. We both try to be silent as we can. Eventually, it stops. After 5 or so minutes of silence, Jacob decides to be brave. He decides that he's gonna wake up my mom to tell her something crazy is going on. I wish he wouldn't leave me alone, but there's absolutely no way I'm gonna go out there. He arms himself as best as he can with a tennis racket we had in the room with us. Then he takes a couple small steps and opens the door and dashes out. I close it as quick as I can behind him. In less than 30 seconds, I hear a scream. Not long after, the door flies open, and he comes back in looking pale as a ghost. He looks tired and his breathing is like he just ran a marathon. His eyes look as big as dinner plates. I then ask what is going on like 4 times before he finally starts getting words out. He tells me he walked out there and he was walking through the garden as quick as he could, and then he saw my mom, just standing there. He tried to talk to her, but she stared at him with a blank expression. Getting super creeped out because of what happened to me earlier, he took a couple more steps towards her, telling her that he thought something was in the woods. Suddenly, her face turned to an awkward smile. Then he realized something terrible. He hadn't noticed sooner because of the darkness, She was on the other side of the fence. Now, the door to this room does not lock, and as I explained earlier, this room had no windows. As he is telling me what happened, he is also at the same time putting stuff in front of the door, and by the end, I was helping him. In retrospect, whatever was harassing us seemed to not want to actually enter the room or the trailer, because the Jacob one didn't come into the room or to the trailer itself. Either way, we stacked everything we could against the door, thinking somehow, like in cartoons, this would actually definitely keep the creature out. So for the rest of the night, we heard scratches coming from all around the room. I, of course, ended up crying. Jacob looked like his mind had left his body with fear. At one point, whatever was out there was speaking as well. I heard it from right next to me where I was resting against the wall, in my mother's low voice, the same exact phrasing she had used earlier in the night. "What's wrong?" Followed by, "Go to sleep." The sun must have come up eventually. The scratching as well stopped. We heard my mom come to get us. This time, we actually heard footsteps. We of course refused to leave the room. My mom had to go get the property owner and have him take the door off. When we saw that it was actually her, I burst into tears again. We never had any experiences like these again, and we eventually moved away. But that one night still haunts me. I still refuse to go out at night unless I'm with a bunch of people, and I will never, ever live in the woods again. Anyways, I hope you all enjoyed hearing about this, as I probably won't tell the story again. Thanks for listening. When I was 23, I had a security gig at a dairy farm in Ohio. It was a modest place, only holding a few dozen cows at any given time. My then co-worker, a 34-year-old recovering meth addict named Corey, had just been fired for letting a cow go missing on his watch. An offense that would get you fired in every sense of the word. For starters, Corey was insane. By the time we met, he was seriously addicted to all kinds of drugs, and it rendered him virtually schizophrenic. Long nights were spent with him during my training period. He would tell me about the CIA and how they were out to get him. He was convinced that they were broadcasting thoughts into his head, and that they would stop at nothing to ruin his life. More than once, I would catch him glancing over his shoulder, or peeking out of windows with a dumb look on his face, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever was following him. That's the type of person that Corey was. Each of our cows had an ear tag labeled with a number. At 8 p.m., they were each to be guided into their own respective stalls and locked in for the night. Padlocks became the norm after an incident with local kids a few years earlier. In the mornings, we would have to carry around a clipboard containing each lock combination and individually release each one. It was the most annoying way to start the day, but the cows were more secure that way. That's what made Corey's story so unbelievable. He had claimed that the previous night, cow number 29 had been locked away in her stall along with the others. He told us that the only thing out of the ordinary that night was a bat stuck in the rafters that he planned to deal with in the morning. In order for his claim to be true, an intruder would have unlocked the barn with a set of keys, unlocked 29's stall with the correct combination, then reset the locks and leave undetected. Either that, or they picked up a 1,600-pound animal and leaped through a window. Considering Corey's nasty habit of abandoning his duties in order to twitch and hallucinate in the corner, a small part of me believed that some two-bit thief might have been able to get one over him. My boss, however, a 50-year-old hothead, concluded that Corey must have been involved with the cow's disappearance and kicked them to the curb. With nobody else to fill his position, my boss had offered to pay me extra for each of his duties that I could complete until we received a new hire. Naturally, I agreed. I would be heading back to school in a few weeks and needed all the money I could get. My first night back at work began normally. Since I would now be doing the work of 2 security guards, I would arrive early to get a head start on Corey's checklist. I started out by sweeping out the barn. Farmhands try to keep the TMR in a long pile just in front of the stall door so the cows could eat throughout the night, but that shit practically painted the floor by the time I got there. Midway through, I noticed something reflective in the corner of the barn. I swept a loose bit of corn and hay over it to investigate. On the floor before me was a neon yellow ear tag, and I picked it up to examine it. 29. Next to 29's ear tag were the skeletal remains of a bat. I guess that was just another thing that Corey never got around to dealing with. I swept up the bones along with the rest of the barn. By the time I finished, it was already 8 p.m. I made my way out to the fields, and one at a time, I guided each cow to its assigned stall. I got through about 10 or so before I noticed something strange. Across the field, about 50 meters away from everything else and all the others, was a cow, alone. It faced away from me, seemingly transfixed on a nearby cornfield. Seeing a cow on its own is nothing strange, as they sometimes need personal space the same way as people do. What was strange, though, was the way that her tail stuck straight out from behind her, unwavering. She stood as if she were afraid to slip, with her feet planted far apart. Perhaps the strangest of all, her head appeared to be tilted at a 90-degree angle. I wasn't eager to tell my boss. They had already put down so many sick cows before, but losing 2 in the matter of a week might have been enough to send them over the edge. That's when I decided to save that cow for last, as I continued to guide the rest of them inside for the night. Being in charge of twice the amount of cows I was used to was time-consuming. It took me nearly an hour to round them up. By the time I locked number 36 for the night, it was 9 o'clock. I should have been making my rounds by then, especially given the circumstances. I just had that last cow to deal with. When contemplating how long it was going to take me to unlock each cow in the morning, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The only stall left empty was number 29. I shuffled to the field, and surely enough, she was there. She hadn't moved an inch since I started the process of moving them. I approached her slowly. It was surreal seeing a creature frozen in such an odd position. As I came up on her, I could hear a definite, but muffled, chittering. It was unlike any noise I had ever heard from a cow. What the fuck did you eat? I thought to myself. I whistled to the cow before approaching her to avoid scaring her. On a dime, the chittering ceased. The cow's left ear rose to face the sky and began to oscillate like the periscope of a submarine. I could tell that moving this one would be a challenge. I rubbed her back, attempting to calm her down. Bonding is key when establishing any sort of relationship with an animal. I had never interacted with 29 before, so we were unfamiliar with each other. Her skin felt bizarre, like clay with hide draped over it. I walked around to see her face. Her eyes were peeled open, darting around. Her mouth hung open and drooped to the side. I examined her left ear, searching for a place to reinsert her tag, but there was no piercing. I strapped the halter to 29's mouth and began to lead her. It was like trying to uproot a tree with a bike chain. Each tug that I gave was useless. I began to put my weight into it, but still, no luck. When I say no luck, I don't mean that 29 wouldn't follow me. I mean that her body showed zero sign of being affected by my body weight whatsoever. Cows are strong creatures, but they're not made of stone. I was perplexed. After 15 minutes of this, I decided that it was useless to continue on, with the clock ever ticking. I could no longer afford to neglect my rounds. I began to walk to the security post to collect my flashlight and get on with the night. I heard a slow trotting. I looked behind me to see that the cow had in fact moved. 29 was now facing me. Not so shy now, I wondered. I turned around and continued walking towards the gate. When I made it halfway through the field, I began to hear the trotting again. But this time, it was louder and much quicker. I smiled to myself. Wish I would have known to walk away sooner. Without turning to face the cow, I walked into the barn and began fumbling with 29's padlock. 3 left, 32 right, 23 left. As the lock clicked open, I heard the floorboards behind me creak. A slow, vocal noise turned to a sickly gurgle. I hope to God whatever you got isn't contagious, I said before spinning around. All color drained from my face as I was greeted with the sight of the 8-foot-tall beast standing before me. On its hind legs, its ears were flapping like a hummingbird's wings. Its head was cocked sideways with one eye focused on me. Its pupils seemed to grow and shrink as it scanned over my entire body. Its lower jaw slowly moved up and down as it began to vocalize again. It began to creep towards me. Its front legs were kicking as it attempted to keep balance, all the while making that same noise. I began to feel lightheaded. I grabbed 29's padlock and made a break for the door. That's when the cow began to stomp behind me. I began to hyperventilate as I sprinted. The rest of the cows were spooked, shaking and jumping around as well. I slammed the door shut and clasped the padlock. A sickening boom shook the entire wall of the barn as 29 began to claw at the door. Oh, 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 the beast croaked before chittering once more. I backed away from the door slowly, its wooden frame bending and contorting at the sheer force behind it. Without another warning, I turned my back to the barn and ran to my car as 29 began wailing and pounding. I never ended up making any rounds that night. Instead, I started my car and left that fucking place in the rear view mirror. I didn't even tell my boss. In fact, I avoided several of his phone calls because I had nothing to say. I figured it would be best if I just quit the easy way. There are certain things in life that back you into corners. Silence forces your hand, you know. That's why I'm writing this now. I still wanted my money. A few weeks later, just before making my 2-hour drive back to college, I stopped by the farm to pick up my final check. My boss wasn't in his office on Tuesdays, so I took advantage of the situation and granted myself access with the key that I had seen him kick under the rug once or twice. After snagging my check and a few Jolly Ranchers, I got in my car and slowly began to drive away. Out of the corner of my eye, a young farmhand standing in the grazing field caught my attention. I lowered my window and said, "Hey kid, stay away from the night shift." But he didn't answer me, nor even look at me. He just continued to stare at the pile of bones before him. As I kept driving, I kept staring at him, and he wouldn't even move an inch. That's when something struck me as odd. His head was tilted sideways, similar to 29's head. I swear, I'm never going back to that farm again. For a few months, I've been having a feral cat that comes to my back porch looking for food. I first saw him in October around 6 p.m. when the sun was going down and I had walked to the back door to take a smoke outside. I could see him through the double window that looks out onto the swamp beyond. He was sitting patiently as if he had been waiting for me. His black, greasy fur reflecting the colors of the sun. When he saw me approaching, He stepped closer to the window and stood on his two back legs and started to paw wildly at the window. I chuckled and walked back to my fridge, pulling out some leftover chicken breast from the night before. I grabbed an old plastic dish from the cabinet and I tore the chicken apart into bite-sized pieces. I returned to the back door. I opened it only enough for me to squeeze out so that he wouldn't bolt into the house. If he did, I knew I would regret it, letting him slip inside, only to possibly infest my home with blood-sucking fleas and to tear up my furniture. I placed the dish down, and he pranced towards it, scarfing it down like it was his first meal in weeks. I looked at him closer, through his long fur, and could see how thin he was. His legs looked like skin and bone, and his cheeks looked sunk in, causing his eyes to protrude out grossly. It was then that I noticed his tar-colored eyes that had no glint to them, no shine from the setting sun. It reminded me of those computer screens that don't reflect pesky sunlight glare coming from your window. I felt uneasy, worried now that he may attack me. However, he looked at me once and blinked slowly before racing down the porch stairs and disappearing into the wooded swamp. I started to wake up every morning only to see the dead corpse of some poor animal when I would take my routinely first smoke of the day. It started with little animals, birds, mice, and other small rodents. I always figured it was just the way that cat was thanking me for feeding him when he came, which was only a couple of times a week. Even though I only saw him a few times, there was always a dead animal on the porch step every morning. I thought it was silly that some old cat would bring me presents every morning. After about a month, the corpses began to get bigger. I was finding more bigger rats and the occasional possum. I started to think it was strange that this cat seemed to catch his dinner just fine, but still came to me for scraps. I always brushed it off though, seeing as it wasn't doing me any harm, and I had no roommates who may have been disturbed by it. However, on one particular cold and foggy morning, I walked to the back deck to have my cigarette, and I looked down to look for my present. There was nothing there. I could feel my heart flutter. I was worried that something may have happened to my little buddy. That feeling quickly left, and I felt my stomach drop as I looked over the railing to see my lawn filled with bodies. I placed a hand over my mouth to catch my gasp. The sight was disgusting and a less than pleasant encounter when all I wanted was to enjoy a smoke. After that occurrence, the dead animal started to appear once again on the back deck. Part of me felt relieved that my cat was okay, while the other part of me felt like something was terribly off. Sometime in January, I woke up in the middle of the night, groggy as hell, but with a strong craving to have a smoke. I walked down the hall and paused at the window overlooking the backyard, and I saw a pale figure that reflected the moonlight. I paused, and my eyes widened. Suddenly, I was no longer groggy. and the urge to smoke disappeared. The figure looked up at me, and I froze. My breathing stopped. I could see its sunken-in eyes staring at me, and its spine protruding from its pale skin that had patches of fur peppered. It looked very strange, almost human-like, hunched over while standing on two legs. I panicked, and I could feel my body growing hot as my heartbeat quickened. After staring at me a little longer, it turned around to crawl over the fence, and then it walked away on its two legs. I went back to bed, completely terrified. I woke up the next morning and rubbed my eyes, releasing a big yawn. I thought to myself, what a crazy dream I had. I got up from bed and walked downstairs to make myself a pot of French press coffee. I grabbed my pack of smokes and my mug and walked out the back door. I walked to the rail with my mug and crossed my arms and leaned over. I instantly dropped my mug and could hear it shatter on the concrete below. Time felt like it had slowed as I looked around to see corpses lacerated and splayed across my yard. The black feral cat was strategically in the middle of all the dead bodies. No mercy was spared to any of those animals. I felt my stomach heave, and I threw up what was left of my dinner from last night. I felt a chill run down my spine as I remembered what I had seen the night before, and I no longer believed it was a dream. I quickly walked back to the door and locked it shut behind me. It felt surreal, and I couldn't imagine that this was happening to me, but to my dismay, it was. I couldn't be bothered to clean all the bodies. I was too fearful to walk out that door. I stayed inside the house for the rest of the day on my computer, looking for solutions to my problem. Of course, I found nothing but nonsense about some beings called rakes, wendigos, and skinwalkers. I strongly felt that this was some person playing a massive prank on me, and I desperately wanted to believe that was the case. I fell asleep at the table in front of the back door. Being the light sleeper that I am, I woke up to a gentle but loud knock at the door, followed by a few more. I immediately sprang up and swiveled around. I pulled the blinds away from the door just enough to peer out the window. Nothing. I walked to the window beside the door and shrieked at what I saw before me. The creature I had just seen the night before had pressed its hands and face against the window and was breathing heavily with a wicked smile plastered against its face. I ran to the counter and snatched my keys, running out the front door to dash to my car. As I got in, I began backing out. That's when I saw the creature come around the side of the house, only to stop when it saw me backing away. It then stood up on its two legs and gave me a slow wave, showing off its nasty pointed teeth and its disgusting smile. I retreated to my sister's home, which was about 30 minutes away, and I busted through the front door with no explanation. She came running down the stairs, with her boyfriend following close behind her. She flicked the lights on and could see how disturbed I looked. taking me to the guest room downstairs. She told me I was welcome to stay as long as I needed. After refusing to tell her what went wrong, I felt crazy after what I saw. Part of me still believing it wasn't real, and another part afraid she would think I was crazy. A few days passed, and I was beginning to feel more at ease. My sister was making breakfast by the time I woke up, and I nodded to her and her boyfriend as I sat down at the table when there was a ring at the doorbell. I went to go see who was there, as I saw my sister was busy and her boyfriend was enjoying a little small talk with her. I opened the door and was surprised to see no one was there. A putrid smell struck my nostrils. I looked down to see the half-rotten body of my feral cat. I was a kid when this happened. My uncle and I were finishing up chopping, gathering firewood for my grandmother because it was getting dark outside. Driving back on a dirt road at about 30 miles per hour, I started getting this awful sense of being watched. Before I could turn to look out my window, my uncle quickly shouted, "Don't." I completely froze. My heart felt like it was beating out of my chest. Then, it completely stopped when I heard a tap-tap on my window. My uncle sped up and started praying in my native language. I didn't know what was going on until our truck suddenly dipped from the bed. My uncle then started saying, "Look at me," and "Don't turn away," over and over. Then I heard it again, but from the window behind me. It was getting harder for me to breathe, and I wanted to cry. A minute or two passed and the truck dipped again. My uncle looked around. It was quiet, besides the truck and the road. He looked at me and said, "We will ask your father to do a prayer in the morning, so the evil will forget our faces." I remember curling up on the seat and just staring at the radio, watching the time, listening to my uncle sing an old prayer until we got to my grandmother's house. I called my uncle because I had a nightmare about that night. We talked about it for a bit, and he said, "I didn't see faces, just eyes, like brake lights that you see on the road. It was looking at you." Before hanging up, I tried joking with him about it. "Why didn't you just step on the brake when it was in the back?" But he didn't laugh. He just stayed silent and said, "Because it wasn't alone." Living in a small town has its advantages. For example, you get to know everyone who lives there pretty quickly. If you ever have a problem, chances are that there's someone in town with the expertise to help you, like Jimmy, our local handyman, electrician, and plumber. If you have a household problem, Jimmy's your guy. If you got a more difficult problem, then you probably want Mac. He's our town sheriff, the only law enforcement we have for a few miles. Are you feeling hungry? Then Sherry's the gal for you. She runs a diner in the center of town, and her pie is out of this world. What I'm trying to say is that it pays to know people. Another thing I find fantastic about living in a small town is the sheer amount of nature that surrounds us, untouched by man. The trees seem to grow endlessly into the sky. The nearby creek is crystal clear, not like those contaminated ones I hear about in the city. But I think the best part about living so far away from the city is the peace and quiet. It's intoxicating. Occasionally, sometimes you'll hear the rumbling of a semi-truck passing by, but that's about it. You could step outside your door at any given time and be greeted with pure silence. I have always found the silence peaceful. like our town was secretly tucked away from the rest of the world. Even though I do enjoy the peace and quiet, that's not always the case for a lot of people. I work in the only gas station for miles, and we often get a lot of people stopping by there to refuel before heading back onto the road. Even though most of the people tend to fill up at the pump and continue their journey, sometimes I'll still get people to come inside, and they'll mention how unnaturally quiet it is in this town. Since I only lived in this town my entire life, I never noticed how different it is from the rest of the world, but I'll just take their word for it. It just makes me uneasy, is what one of the customers said to me when I inquired. They said they couldn't put their finger on it. Just something about the silence of our town made them uncomfortable. Well, this town makes me uncomfortable too, but it's not the silence that drives my fear. It's something that happened to me when I was a kid. My friend Tommy and I were always together as children. We would do everything together, explore the forest, fish in the creek, play in one of the many meadows that littered our town until the moon signaled our curfew. It was early October when it happened. We were playing together as usual, riding bikes up and down the town, until he got the bright idea to pay a visit to the Blackbriar farm. Now, this farm has a bit of history, but I'll try to sum it up. Basically, the Blackbriars were the first to settle in this town. They were a working class family, and their main export was corn. They had cornfields as far as the eye could see. The town itself was in the early stages of forming next to the farm. Then one day, in the middle of October, the entire Blackbriar family disappeared. Nobody knew why. Some people said that the head of the household, Michael Blackbriar, took sick and passed away, and at that point, the farm was too much to maintain without him, so his family left the farm for greener fields. Others think a pack of wolves or some other animal got to the family and tore them apart, and they were never seen again. Regardless of what happened, the farm was abandoned and had been left untouched for decades. For some reason, our town either didn't have the will or the means to tear the farm down and start something new, so the old farmhouse was just left, standing there. Even though the house remained empty, the cornfield seemed to continue to grow year after year. They would produce, and even our local market owner would pick fresh corn from the field and use it. "There's no point in letting it go to waste," they would say. Then the field would wither and die, only to regrow all over again the following year. So Tommy wanted to go exploring in the field. He had this absurd notion that the Blackbriars had a stash of treasure somewhere on the farm itself. After all, they were a supplier of produce for a while, and the town didn't have a bank during those times, so they had to do something with all that money. Well, the sun was quickly setting as we approached the edge of the farm. Reluctantly, I followed Tommy into the looming forest of dried corn husk. Our footsteps crunched beneath us as we marched further inward. It was deafening how loud our footsteps were in comparison to the rest of our surroundings. As we pressed on, we began to hear a new sound. It was faint, over the crunch of our footfalls at first, but as we walked closer, the sound grew louder. It was crying. Someone was sitting in the cornfield, softly crying to themselves. Unsure of the situation, I asked Tommy if we could head back, but he shook his head, mentioning that someone might need our help. We found ourselves in a small clearing in the field. On the other side from where we entered, we saw it, or I should say, her. It was a woman. She was sitting on the cold ground. She was wearing a silky white dress, which had been stained by the dirt she rested on. Long brownish black hair covered her face and shoulders. She sat facing away from us, and the sobs that she was doing seemed to reverberate off the surrounding stalks of corn. Tommy fearlessly approached her and asked her if she was alright. When he did, her sobs instantly stopped, and the overwhelming silence returned. She rose to her feet, still facing away from us. I took a step backward, while Tommy took a step ahead. Then she turned. But how she did it triggered alarms off in my head. 1 second, she was facing away, and in the blink of an eye, she was turned towards us, as if she were a glitch in a video game. She raised her head, and her hair parted from her face, revealing a gory facade. Its flesh clung to her skull like tape. Half of her jawbone was exposed. Her eyes were gray and lifeless. Dirt seemed to pepper the remaining parts of her skin, which combined to form a sickly brownish color. Tommy and I both screamed. I immediately turned to run away, but then I heard Tommy call out to me. My body reacted on its own, and I turned back. Tommy had been grabbed. Her hand gripped his wrist so tight that even from where I was standing, I could hear the bones in Tommy's wrist begin to splinter. Her mouth began to open and separate, as if she were some sort of snake-like creature. She pulled him closer and raised him up. Tommy struggled to turn his head away from the creature to look at me, and managed to say one thing to me, the last thing I would ever hear from my best friend. "Run!" And I did. I ran through the cornfield as fast as I could. Tears streamed down my face like a waterfall as I realized I left my best friend behind to die. I made it to my bike and pedaled as fast as I could to the police station. I told Mac everything that happened. He quickly gathered up a search party, and it was almost every single person in town. After going through the cornfield for hours, they found no trace of the woman, and the only thing they found of Tommy's was the shoe. Weeks turned into months, which turned into years. Eventually, everyone in the town started to forget. It was just another tragic missing child's case to everyone, aside from Tommy's parents and myself, that is. New children began telling stories about the cornfield, how anyone who goes in is never heard from again. Those stories aren't entirely accurate, because I was there with Tommy that day, and I made it out, alive. Not a single day goes by that I don't regret what I did, and not a single night goes by that I don't have to drink myself into a drunken slumber. Ever since I started working at this gas station, I saved up enough money to move away from this town for good, to start a new life somewhere, far away, away from the cornfield, and away from the tragic memory of my dear friend. I plan on leaving at the end of October, but 2 nights ago, after I was closing up the gas station, I heard it. The silence broken by some faint sobs coming from the other side of the road. My body seized as I saw her, standing there on the other side of the road. I wanted to believe that I was just seeing things, but I knew better than that. She was facing away from me, and without even giving her a second to turn around, I ran to my car, got inside, and drove away. I'm at home right now, and I wanted to type this up before I leave this place for good, just so whoever hears this knows how sorry I am for Tommy, and to stay away from the Blackbriar farm. I'm not really sure where I'm gonna go, but I need to hurry. I left my window open, and I think I just heard some crying coming from outside. So if I don't make it, remember, if you hear a woman softly crying to herself, just stay away and call the police, or you might end up just like my best friend, Tommy. When I was 13, I was on an ATV with my 2 older sisters, one 15 and the other 18. We were going to my grandma's place, which was less than 2 kilometers away from my parents' place. We were traveling through our fields, but on the way, I suggested we go around the fence so we didn't have to open the gates. It was pretty much the same road, just a bit off to the side. As we get to the middle of the field, we all noticed something sitting on top of the hill we were about to climb. We slowed to a crawl because it looked human. We thought maybe it was an animal that had fell and was stuck, or maybe it was my uncle who looked after the cattle. But this thing was sitting weird. basically like how Spider-Man perches over buildings, crouched down on top of a rock. I want to describe this thing. It was tall, skinny, and was wearing nothing. Just the body is what we could see, grayish color, and the head wasn't shaped like a human's head. It was thin and small. We were about 30 to 40 meters from this thing, and it was during the day too. As we were sitting there trying to figure out what we were seeing, this thing slowly stood up and my heart sank. Its arms were long, very long. I screamed to stop and instantly jumped from the front of the ATV to the driver, replacing my sister. As we were switching, this thing started running at us, but it was running weird. Its arms were swaying back and forth like normal runner, but because of how long the arms were, it looked weird. You would think it would run on the long arms, but it didn't, and it was running fast. I turned around and shot off straight through the field. My sisters were screaming that it was still coming, but to be honest, I could not look back at this thing, so I just said, "Don't look at it." We rounded the corner, and that's the last we saw of it. As we got home, I crashed the ATV into the deck, trying to get in as fast as we could. We were so scared, my parents actually believed us. They called all the family to warn in case it was a trespasser. They said nobody saw anything or anyone in the fields after that.